It was a Tuesday morning in October 2019 when Priscilla Presley found something in her mail that made her hands shake. Not bills, not fan letters, not the usual business correspondence that filled her Beverly Hills mailbox. This was different. An elegant cream-colored envelope with her name written in gold calligraphy, postmarked from Memphis, Tennessee. She hadn't been back to Memphis in over 15 years. Not since that final, bitter court battle over Elvis's estate that had torn apart what remained of their fragile post-divorce relationship. The city held too many ghosts, too many memories of a life that had nearly destroyed her. But curiosity got the better of her. Inside was an invitation to the annual Memphis Children's Charity Gala honoring families who have made a difference. The event was being held at the Peabody Hotel's Grand Ballroom on November 8th. Black tie required. RSVP by October 25th. What struck her wasn't the charity aspect, though she'd always been passionate about children's causes. What made her sink into her kitchen chair was the signature at the bottom, with deepest respect, the Elvis Presley Estate Foundation. They wanted her there. After decades of legal battles, public disputes, and carefully maintained distance, they were reaching out. Priscilla set the invitation on her marble countertop and stared at it for what felt like hours. Lisa Marie had been gone for 10 months now, and the grief was still raw, still overwhelming. Her daughter's death had left her questioning everything, revisiting every choice she'd made as a mother, as Elvis's wife, as the guardian of his legacy after he was gone. The timing felt cruel, or maybe it felt like fate. She picked up her phone 3 different times to call her assistant and declined politely. Each time she set it back down. Something about this invitation felt different from the countless others she'd received over the years. This wasn't about using her name for publicity or capitalizing on her connection to Elvis. The charity was legitimate, she knew that much. They'd been operating in Memphis for decades, helping children from broken homes find stability and support. Children from broken homes, just like Lisa Marie had been in many ways. Just like she herself had been, growing up without a father, moved from base to base with her military stepfather, never quite feeling like she belonged anywhere until she met a young singer in Germany who made her feel like the most important person in the world. That was before she learned what it meant to share him with millions of screaming fans. Before she understood that loving Elvis Presley meant loving a man who belonged more to the world than he ever could to her. The invitation sat on her counter for 5 days. Friends called, asking about her holiday plans, about how she was coping with Lisa Marie's loss, about her upcoming projects. She mentioned the invitation to no one. This felt too personal, too loaded with the weight of everything she'd spent 40 years trying to process and move beyond. On Sunday evening, she finally called the number on the invitation. A sweet southern voice answered, introducing herself as Margaret from the Charity Foundation. "Mrs. Presley, we're so honored you're considering joining us," Margaret said, and Priscilla could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "I have to tell you, when the board suggested reaching out to you, there was some debate, not because we don't respect you, but because we know how difficult it must be to be constantly reminded of the past." That honesty surprised her. Most people danced around her relationship with Elvis, either treating her like a living museum piece or pretending the pain didn't exist. "But here's the thing," Margaret continued. "This year's gala theme is about resilience, about families who have faced impossible circumstances and found ways to help others heal. Your story, Mrs. Presley, isn't just about being married to Elvis. It's about being a single mother who raised a daughter in the shadow of the world's most famous man. It's about surviving loss and finding purpose. The children we serve, they need to see that." Priscilla found herself wiping away tears she hadn't expected. When was the last time someone had seen her story as more than just a footnote to Elvis's legacy? "Will there be media there?" she asked, already knowing the answer would influence her decision. "Some local coverage, yes. But Mrs. Presley, I want you to know something. The ballroom we're using, it's the same one where you and Mr. Presley had your first public appearance as a married couple back in 1967. The charity chose it specifically because that room represents hope and new beginnings, even when things don't end the way we planned." The words hit her like a physical blow. Of course they'd chosen that room. Of course this was all connected to that night 52 years ago when she'd walked into that same ballroom as a newlywed, believing she'd found her forever, having no idea that within a few years she'd be planning her escape from the very life everyone envied. "I need some time to think," she managed to say. "Of course, but Mrs. Presley, sometimes the things that scare us most are the things we need to face." After hanging up, Priscilla walked out to her garden, the invitation still clutched in her hand. The October air was cool, and she could hear the distant hum of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. This was her life now, quiet, controlled, safe. No screaming crowds, no constant scrutiny, no sharing the man she loved with the world. But it was also lonely, and with Lisa Marie gone, the loneliness felt suffocating. Maybe it was time to stop running from Memphis. Maybe it was time to face that ballroom and everything it represented. Maybe, at 74 years old, she was finally ready to confront the ghosts that had been chasing her for half a century. She looked at the invitation one more time, then walked back inside to call Margaret. "I'll be there," she said simply. What she didn't know was that this decision would lead to the most honest, painful, and ultimately healing moment of her life since Elvis died. The moment Priscilla stepped out of her hired car at the Peabody Hotel, she knew she'd made a mistake. The November air in Memphis carried that familiar mixture of barbecue smoke and Mississippi River humidity that instantly transporting her back to 1967, back to when she was 22 years old and thought she understood what love meant. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her black evening gown and walked toward the entrance. She'd chosen black deliberately, though she couldn't quite say why. Maybe it felt appropriate for a woman attending her own funeral, because that's what this felt like. The death of the last piece of privacy she'd managed to maintain about her marriage to Elvis. The lobby buzzed with well-dressed guests, their conversations punctuated by laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Priscilla recognized the scene immediately. This was Memphis society at its finest, the same crowd that had once welcomed her as Elvis's young bride and then whispered behind her back when their marriage fell apart. "Priscilla, my God, is that really you?" She turned to find Barbara Mitchell, wife of one of Elvis's former business associates, approaching with arms outstretched. Barbara had aged, of course, but she still carried herself with that particular Memphis socialite confidence that Priscilla remembered both admiring and resenting. Priscilla managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been a long time." "Too long, darling. We were all so sorry to hear about Lisa Marie, such a tragedy, but look at you, you haven't aged a day." Barbara's eyes were kind, but Priscilla could see the curiosity burning behind them. Everyone wanted to know why she was here, why now, after all these years of staying away. More faces emerged from the crowd, some familiar, others vaguely recognizable from decades past. Sam Phillips's widow, Helen, approached with genuine warmth. Colonel Parker's former assistant, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack. Men who'd worked at Sun Records, wives of musicians who'd toured with Elvis, people who'd orbited their world during those intense, chaotic years when Elvis was transitioning from rising star to global phenomenon. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Surprise at seeing her, condolences about Lisa Marie, awkward pauses where they clearly wanted to ask about Elvis but didn't quite dare. Priscilla found herself giving the same responses over and over, her public smile feeling more strained with each interaction. "You know, Priscilla," said Jim Peterson, one of Elvis's former sound engineers, "I always wondered what would have happened if things had been different, if the fame hadn't gotten so crazy, if he hadn't been pulled in so many directions." It was an innocent comment, probably meant with kindness, but it hit Priscilla like a slap. If things had been different, as if their marriage had been some victim of circumstance rather than the result of real choices made by real people. As if Elvis's affairs, his drug use, his inability to separate the man from the performer had all been somehow inevitable rather than devastating personal failures. "Things were exactly as they needed to be," she replied coolly, ending that conversation quickly. But as she moved deeper into the pre-reception area, the weight of the past pressed down on her more heavily. A gospel quartet was performing near the bar, and their harmonies reminded her instantly of the music that used to drift from Elvis's bedroom at Graceland when he'd practice with the guys. The scent of magnolia from the hotel's flower arrangements was the same perfume she'd worn on their wedding day. Even the way the light caught the crystal chandelier above seemed designed to trigger memories she'd spent decades trying to manage. Mrs. Presley, a young woman, approached, clipboard in hand and excitement barely contained in her voice. "I'm Sarah, one of the event coordinators. We are so honored to have you here tonight. If you'd like, I can show you to your table now." Priscilla nodded, grateful for an excuse to move away from the crowd. But as Sarah led her toward the grand ballroom, she felt her chest tighten. She recognized the hallway, the ornate doors, even the pattern in the carpet. This was the exact path she'd walked 52 years ago, arm in arm with Elvis, both of them grinning like teenagers at their first formal event as husband and wife. She remembered how nervous she'd been that night, worried about saying the wrong thing or embarrassing him in front of Memphis's elite. How he'd squeezed her hand and whispered, "Just be yourself, baby. That's all I ever wanted." She'd believed him then. It had taken her years to understand that Elvis himself didn't know who he was anymore, so how could he possibly know what he wanted from her? "Your table is right here, Mrs. Presley," Sarah said, gesturing to a round table near the front of the ballroom. "Table 1, of course. You'll have a perfect view of tonight's entertainment." Entertainment. The word made Priscilla's stomach clench. She'd been so focused on the decision to attend, on the emotional challenge of returning to Memphis, that she hadn't really processed what the evening would actually entail. A charity gala honoring Elvis's memory would naturally include tribute performances, music, his songs, possibly even footage of him performing. As she took her seat, she scanned the program that had been placed at her setting. An evening celebrating the King's legacy of giving. Featured performers included 3 different Elvis tribute artists, the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, and a special musical tribute featuring original arrangements. Original arrangements. Her heart began to race as she realized what that might mean. She looked around the ballroom, really looked at it for the first time since entering. The staging area, the way the tables were positioned, even the lighting setup was almost identical to how it had been configured for their first public appearance as a married couple. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was sitting alone at a table for 10, surrounded by empty chairs, in the same ballroom where she'd once sat beside the man she loved, believing they'd have forever together. Now she was here as his widow, though they'd been divorced for 37 years when he died. She was here as the mother of his only child, who was also gone. She was here as the keeper of memories that had become more burden than blessing. Other guests were finding their seats now, and she could feel their eyes on her. Some tried to be discreet, others stared openly. She was the living reminder of Elvis's private life, the woman who'd seen him at his most vulnerable and his most destructive. Her presence here was like a ghost, materializing at a party thrown in honor of a man whose real story had been carefully sanitized for public consumption. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcement over the sound system, "please take your seats as we prepare to begin this evening's celebration." Priscilla gripped her program tighter and looked toward the stage. Whatever was about to happen, she was committed now. There was no graceful way to leave, no escape from whatever memories this evening was about to resurrect. The lights began to dim, and she heard the rustle of the orchestra tuning their instruments. Her mouth went dry as she recognized the setup, the same configuration that had been used for their wedding reception all those years ago. She had no idea that in just moments, her carefully constructed public silence about her marriage to Elvis was about to be shattered forever. The first note hit her like a physical blow to the chest. It wasn't just any song. It wasn't Hound Dog or Can't Help Myself or any of the hits that had made Elvis famous. It was the soft, tender opening of Love Me Tender, played exactly as it had been arranged for their wedding reception in 1967. The same key, the same tempo, the same heartbreaking gentleness that had made her cry with joy when she first heard Elvis sing it to her privately at Graceland. Priscilla's champagne glass nearly slipped from her fingers as the Memphis Symphony Orchestra began the introduction. But this wasn't just any orchestra. As her eyes adjusted to the stage lighting, she realized with growing horror that she recognized some of the musicians. These were the same men who had played at their wedding reception 52 years ago, the ones still alive, now gray-haired and weathered, but playing with the same precise emotion they'd brought to her wedding day. The conductor raised his baton, and Priscilla knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Someone in the charity organization had done their research. Someone had found the original wedding arrangements, tracked down the surviving musicians, and decided that the perfect way to honor Elvis's legacy was to recreate the most intimate, personal moment of his life for a room full of strangers. As the familiar melody filled the ballroom, Priscilla was no longer 74 years old. She was 22 again, wearing her white cocktail dress, her hand in Elvis's as they swayed together while their wedding guests watched and applauded. She could smell his cologne, feel the nervous excitement radiating from him as he whispered the lyrics in her ear instead of singing them aloud. But he had let her go. She'd been the one who left, finally, but only after years of him letting her slip away piece by piece, choosing pills over presents, fans over family, the image of Elvis Presley over the reality of being her husband. The couple at the table next to her was swaying gently to the music, smiling at each other with the kind of easy affection that comes from years of genuine partnership. Priscilla watched them and felt a familiar stab of grief, not just for Elvis, but for the marriage she'd imagined they would have. The one where he came home at night instead of disappearing for weeks on tour. The one where she was his wife, not just another member of his entourage competing for attention. Around the ballroom, she could see other guests dabbing at their eyes, moved by the beauty of the music and the romance of the moment. They saw a loving tribute to the king and his bride. They had no idea they were watching a woman relive the beginning of the most painful chapter of her life. The song continued, each note a reminder of promises that had been broken before the ink was dry on their marriage certificate. Elvis had meant those promises when he made them, she knew that now. But meaning something and being able to keep it were two very different things, especially when you were Elvis Presley and the whole world believed they owned a piece of you. As the orchestra moved into the second verse, Priscilla closed her eyes and let herself remember the rest of that night. How happy Elvis had been, how he'd pulled her aside between courses to tell her this was the best day of his life. How he'd promised her they'd have their own little world at Graceland, away from the madness, just the two of them building something real together. She'd believed him. God help her, she'd believed every word. But within months, she was eating dinner alone while he recorded until 3 in the morning. She was sleeping alone while he traveled with his musicians and his manager and his ever-present entourage of yes-men who treated her like a pretty accessory rather than his wife. She was raising their daughter alone while he lost himself in pills and performances and the desperate need to be loved by everyone except the woman who was already standing right beside him. The music swelled, and Priscilla opened her eyes to find that several people at nearby tables were looking at her, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed curiosity. She was the star of this show, whether she wanted to be or not. The grieving widow who wasn't actually a widow. The woman who'd walked away from the fairy tale that everyone else in the room would have killed to live. What they didn't understand, what nobody who hadn't lived it could understand, was that fairy tales only work when both people in them are allowed to be human. Elvis had become a character, a creation, a brand. And being married to a character meant she'd stopped being a real person too. She'd become Mrs. Elvis Presley, a role she was expected to play perfectly while her actual husband disappeared behind the demands of his image. As the song reached its climax, she found herself remembering the last time she'd heard Elvis sing their wedding song. It was 1973, just months before she filed for divorce. Lisa Marie had been asleep, and she'd found Elvis in the music room at Graceland, playing his guitar and singing softly to himself. She'd stood in the doorway listening, hoping he might notice her, might invite her to sit with him the way he used to. Instead, he'd looked up when he finished the song and said, "Oh, hey Scylla, didn't see you there. I was just working on something for the Vegas show." Even their wedding song had become part of his act. The orchestra held the final note, letting it hang in the air like a question that would never be answered. When the applause began, it was thunderous, emotional, the kind of ovation that comes from people who believe they've witnessed something sacred. Priscilla clapped politely, mechanically, while inside she felt something breaking apart that she'd spent decades holding together. This wasn't a tribute to their love story. This was a public execution of her privacy, a forced march through memories she'd never wanted to share with anyone. As the applause died down, and the master of ceremonies approached the microphone to introduce the next segment of the evening, Priscilla made a decision that surprised even her. She stood up. Every eye in the ballroom turned to her as she moved away from her table and walked toward the stage. The master of ceremonies paused, clearly confused about whether this was part of the program. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of her heels on the polished floor. For 52 years, she'd kept her silence about what it had really been like to be married to Elvis Presley. She'd protected his image, honored his memory, and carefully crafted her public statements to preserve the myth that everyone wanted to believe. But sitting in that ballroom, listening to their wedding song performed for strangers who thought they understood her story, something inside her finally snapped. It was time to tell the truth. The microphone felt heavier than it should have as Priscilla adjusted it to her height. 500 pairs of eyes stared at her in absolute silence, waiting for whatever words would come from the woman who had guarded her secrets about Elvis Presley for over half a century. She looked out at the crowd, recognizing faces from her past, seeing strangers who knew her only as a footnote in someone else's story, and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete freedom. Freedom from protecting anyone's image but her own. Freedom from maintaining a carefully crafted public narrative. Freedom to finally tell the truth about what it had really been like to love Elvis Presley. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I came here thinking I could sit quietly, write a check to a good cause, and slip away without stirring up the past. But then they played our wedding song." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "That beautiful song you just heard, played so perfectly by these wonderful musicians, some of whom were there on February 1st, 1967, when Elvis and I celebrated our wedding reception in this very ballroom. What you witnessed just now wasn't just a tribute to Elvis's music. You witnessed the soundtrack to the most hopeful moment of my life, followed immediately by the beginning of the most difficult years I would ever endure." The silence in the room was absolute. Not a glass clinked, not a chair creaked. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Everyone wants to know what it was really like to be married to Elvis Presley. The magazines, the biographers, the fans, they all want the fairy tale or the scandal. They want the perfect love story or the dramatic exposé. But the truth is neither of those things. The truth is more complicated and more heartbreaking than either version. Priscilla's voice grew stronger as she continued, decades of suppressed honesty finally finding their voice. "I was 17 when I met Elvis and 22 when I married him. I thought I knew what I was signing up for. I thought love would be enough to overcome anything. I believed that behind the screaming crowds and the flashing cameras, there would be a private space where we could just be Elvis and Priscilla, husband and wife, building a life together." She looked directly at Margaret, the charity coordinator who had convinced her to attend, and saw tears streaming down the woman's face. "Here's what I learned, and it took me years to understand this. When you marry someone who belongs to the world, you don't get to be their wife. You get to be one of many people competing for pieces of them. And Elvis, God bless him, he wanted to give everyone what they needed. The fans needed him to be the king. The colonel needed him to be profitable. The band needed him to be their leader. His mother needed him to be her little boy, and I needed him to be my husband." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "The problem was, there wasn't enough of Elvis to go around, so I got what was left over after everyone else had taken their piece. I got the exhausted man who came home at 4 in the morning. I got the frustrated artist who felt trapped by his own success. I got the lost boy who turned to pills because he couldn't figure out how to be human and be Elvis Presley at the same time." The crowd was completely motionless, hanging on every word. This wasn't the sanitized version of their relationship they'd heard in interviews or read in authorized biographies. This was raw, unfiltered truth from the only person who had lived it. I want to be clear about something, Priscilla continued, her voice growing firmer. Elvis was not a bad man. He was a good man trapped in an impossible situation. He loved me, I know that. He loved Lisa Marie more than his own life. But he didn't know how to love us and still be Elvis Presley. He thought he had to choose between his family and his career, and the world made it very clear which choice they expected him to make. She paused, gathering herself for what came next. I left him because I realized that staying was killing all of us. Elvis was drowning in pills and exhaustion. I was disappearing into depression and loneliness. And our daughter was growing up thinking that Daddy was the man she saw on television, not the man who lived in our house. I left because sometimes loving someone means saving them from the version of themselves they can't escape on their own. The emotion in her voice was unmistakable now. People have called me cold for leaving. They've said I abandoned Elvis when he needed me most. But let me tell you something, I fought for that man every single day for 6 years. I fought the colonel who treated him like property. I fought the hangers-on who enabled his worst impulses. I fought the pills and the schedules and the impossible demands. But I couldn't fight Elvis himself, and eventually I realized that's what I was being asked to do. She took a deep breath, approaching the heart of what she'd come to say. After Elvis died, I spent 40 years protecting his image, making sure Lisa Marie understood her father as a hero, not as the broken man who couldn't save himself. I've given interviews where I focused on the good times. I've supported projects that celebrated his music and his generosity. And I've kept quiet about the nights. I cried myself to sleep in an empty bed at Graceland, while my husband was downstairs with his entourage, or on the road with his band, or lost in a haze of prescription drugs that he thought would help him cope with being Elvis Presley. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning running. But tonight, listening to that song, sitting in this room where we celebrated the beginning of our marriage, I realized something. The greatest disservice I can do to Elvis's memory is to keep pretending that our love story was something other than what it was. The story of two people who loved each other desperately but couldn't figure out how to make that love survive the weight of impossible expectations. She looked around the room one final time. So that's my truth. That's what it was really like to be married to Elvis Presley. It was beautiful and terrible and heartbreaking, and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, because it gave me Lisa Marie, and it taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go. Priscilla stepped back from the microphone, and the applause that followed wasn't the polite charitable gala applause from earlier in the evening. This was something deeper, more emotional, the sound of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. As she walked back to her table on shaking legs, Priscilla felt lighter than she had in decades. The truth was finally out, and whatever happened next, at least it would be based on reality rather than myth. What did you think about Priscilla's courage to finally speak her truth after 50 years of silence? Do you think she was right to leave Elvis, or should she have stayed and fought longer? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible untold celebrity stories.